My name is Jean Thompson. I am 30 years old, and when I look back on my life, it feels like the story of two very different women. There was the June who loved beside her husband Kenneth in a cabin by the lake. And then there was the June who sat alone in a wooden house on Maple Street, surrounded by silence that seemed to grow heavier with every season. When Kenneth passed, the walls seemed to breathe a kind of emptiness that no lamp, no radio, no recipe could fill. The house had once been filled with his footsteps, his gentle cough, the sound of him turning the pages of the newspaper at 6:30 in the morning. Now it only echoed with the hum of their refrigerator and the creak of the stairs. I poured myself into Wayne Minley's son. From the time he was a boy, I'd promised myself he would never feel the weight of sacrifice that Kenneth and I had carried. I paid his tuition without letting him know how many nights I went without proper meals. I sent money for his rent, even when it meant delaying my own repairs. When he finished college, I sold the lakeside cabin, the place where Kenneth and I had carved our initials into the wood railing, just so Wayne could have a down payment for his first home. I told myself it was worth it. He was my future, and my happiness would live in his happiness. When Wayne brought Amy to meet me, I believed I was finally seeing the next chapter unfold. She was polished, well-spoken, and attentive. She asked about my cooking, smiled at my old stories, and even helped clear the table without being asked. For a while, I felt like I had gained a daughter. Holidays were warm dinners, felt whole again. And I thought Kenneth would have been proud, but the warmth cooled quietly. Calls became shorter, invitations turned vague. Thanksgiving came and went with an excuse about keeping things simple. Christmas arrived with news that they'd already booked a retreat for two. I mailed gifts tied with gold ribbon and careful handwriting, hoping that thoughtfulness could fill the growing distance. Amy's tone shifted from sweet to politely distant. Her smile practiced her words clipped. I told myself not to interfere, not to be the mother who overstayed her welcome. Then came the Sunday afternoon video call. The light through my kitchen window was soft that day. I had brewed tea, put on a fresh blouse, and even turned on the good lamp because Wayne once told me the shadows made me look tired. Wayne chatted for a while about groceries and work before stepping away for a phone call. Amy sat at the table and I stayed quiet, sipping my tea, thinking maybe this was a chance for us to connect. Her voice drifted in from just outside the frame. I cannot stand her. She just inserts herself like she owns everything. My breath caught and I froze. She paced her shadow crossing the wall, then added almost casually that having me around was like having a second mother, and not in a good way. When Wayne returned, I smiled as if nothing had happened. I ended the call with love in my voice, though micest act. Later that night, a message lit up my phone. Mom, please call before you visit. It's better that way. No punctuation, no explanation, just those words. I read them over and over until the letters blurred. It was not anger that filled me, but something heavier, recognition. I was no longer welcome in my son's home, and I had no idea when or how it had happened. The realization pressed down harder than the silence of Maple Street ever had. After Kenneth passed, people assumed I had stepped away from the world we built together. They saw me as a grieving widow who no longer had the strength or the interest to manage a business. What no one knew was that Thompson and Cole, the construction company Kenneth and I had created from nothing more than determination, and sleepless nights still had my name woven into its foundation. Kenneth and I had started with one truck, one set of tools, and a single handshake contract. We grew into a firm respected across Vermont and beyond. When the funeral ended and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, I made a decision. I handed the day-to-day operations to Marcus Cole, Kenneth's old partner, and the one man I trusted like family. Marcus had been with us since the first foundation was poured. He was steady, loyal, and meticulous. The world saw him as the leader now, but the truth was different. On the documents that mattered most, the ones hidden in plain sight, I remained the majority owner. My signature still approved budgets. My hand still guided the direction of projects. I simply chose to step back from the spotlight. I discovered that invisibility has its own kind of power. People speak more freely when they believe you are irrelevant. They show you their unpolished selves when they think you hold no sway. It was in this quiet space that I began to watch Amy more closely. She entered Thompson and Cole through what seemed like chance, taking a role that aligned perfectly with her polished confidence and her hunger for advancement. She spoke of deadlines and clients with authority that impressed those around her. Her charm opened doors. Her ambition kept them wide. She would often talk at family dinners about how upper management leaned on her whenever things became messy, how her skills kept projects from falling apart, how indispensable she was becoming. Wayne listened with pride, his eyes bright with admiration. I smiled and nodded, pretending to be impressed. Inside, I was cataloging every word, every gesture, every sign of the person she was revealing herself to be. She had no idea that the budget she bragged about mastering were ones I had approved. She did not know that Thevendor contracts she claimed to negotiate crossed my desk long before they reached hers. I kept my silence, because silence can be more instructive than confrontation. By letting her believe she was outmaneuvering everyone, I gave her therapy to weave her own web. Her ambition blinded her to the truth. She never once looked past the surface of the paperwork. She never thought to ask who held the actual keys. She thought she was rising by her own skill. In reality, she was climbing a ladder that I had built and still controlled. Every time she dismissed me as intrusive, every time she closed the door to Wayne's home and barred me from the table, she did so with the confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath her washers. What she did not realize was that ground still belonged to me. I chose to wait. Patience had always been my strength, and now it would be my weapon. The time would come when she would see exactly who had been watching and how fragile her throne really was. I asked Marcus to look into Amy's projects without drawing attention. His voice on the phone was steady, the same voice that had seen me through late nights in the office with Kenneth. He said, "Give me a week." In less than 4 days, he was sitting across from me in the sunroom with a folder that looked too heavy for what it contained. I slid my hands across the cover and felt the weight of secrets that were about to be exposed. Inside were reports that made my stomach tighten. Project costs inflated by numbers that could never be explained by oversight. Vendor names that trace back to empty offices and shell companies with no history before the last 2 years. There were receipts for flights and hotel stays in Napa Valley and Aspen, each listed under client development. Yet every trip lined up with long weekends that had nothing to do with business. Marcus flipped the pages quietly while I read, his eyes calm but sharp. The light from the late afternoon spilled through the window and landed on the papers. The glow made every line of ink stand out like a scar. I studied Amy's name written across approval. She had no right to sign the contracts she had pushed through without question, the arrogance of thinking no one was watching. My pulse was steady, but the air in the room seemed to grow thinner with every page. It was not just theft of money. It was theft of trust of the very company Kenneth and I had built from the dust of our youth. I closed the folder and held it against my chest. Anger pressed against the edges of my restraint, but I did not let it spill. This was not the time for shouting, not the moment to storm into her office. This was about precision, about timing, about letting her walk deeper into her own illusion until the fall would be undeniable. I looked at Marcus and thanked him. The decision was made. I would not confront Amy in private. I would wait until the boardroom, the place she believed she controlled, and show her that every inch of her rise had been borrowed ground. I asked Wayne to meet me at the small cafe near the edge of town, the one where we used to sit when he was in high school and dream about his future. The tables were still the same chipped wood, and the coffee still smelled like burnt beans and cinnamon, but the years between us made it feel like another world. He walked in with his shoulders hunched, kissed my cheek out of habit, and set his phone on the table as if it were more important than the moment we were about to share. We spoke about nothing at first. The weather, the construction on Main Street, the price of gas. I stirred my coffee and studied his face, the small lines around his eyes, the way he rubbed his thumb over his wedding band when he was nervous. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask the question that had been tearing at me. Do you think I am disruptive when I call or visit? Do you feel like I am intruding? The words seemed to hang between us longer than they should. Wayne looked down at his hands and shifted in his seat. He started to speak, then stopped, his mouth closing as if silence was safer than truth. He said that sometimes I came from a different place than Amy, that maybe we misunderstood each other. But it was not an answer. It was an escape. I watched him fold into himself, not toward me, not toward her, but into a corner where he would not have to choose. In that silence, I understood the cruelest part. He had not chosen Amy over me. He had chosen not to choose at all. That silence was louder than any rejection, heavier than any insult. I sipped the last of my coffee and let the subject die. Knowing that the fracture between us was no longer just about Amy, it was about the emptiness that comes when love refuses to speak. The boardroom of Thompson & Cole had always felt imposing with its long polished table and tall windows that let the sunlight fall across every surface. That afternoon, the light cut through the room like a spotlight illuminating, every face gathered in silence. I took my place at the head of the table, my hands steady on the wood, while Marcus arranged the thick folders in front of him with the precision of a man who knew the weight of what they contained. The senior staff members shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between me and Marcus. Sensing that something unusual was about to happen, Marcus opened the first folder and spoke in his calm, deliberate voice. He showed evidence of shell companies created within the last 2 years. Companies with no history or employees yet approved for contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He passed around invoices that had been inflated far beyond market rates. The papers moved down the table like a trail of fire. Next came the expense reports. They revealed weekends in Napa Valley and Aspen listed as client meetings, the same dates that coincided with long holidays. Each receipt bore Amy's approval. The room grew quieter. The sound of paper rustling replaced by the heavy stillness of realization. Amy sat across from me. Her chin raised, her expression carefully controlled, but I saw the tension in her jaw. She leaned forward and said this was a misunderstanding, that the accusations were personal, that family issues were being dragged into the company. Her voice held his usual confidence, but it did not reach her eyes. She insisted I had no authority to question her decisions. For a moment, the staff looked at me uncertain, caught between loyalty to their roles and the authority they assumed Amy carried. I rose slowly from my chair. The sunlight caught the edge of the table and stretched across the room. I looked directly at her and said with a voice that carried to every corner, I do. I always have. You worked for me, Amy, and now you don't. The words settled like stone in the air. The silence that followed was absolute. Wayne sat to my left, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, as if he had forgotten how to speak. The staff stared between us, their shock written plainly in their stillness. Amy's mask slipped, then just for a second enough to show the fear beneath the polish. She tried to gather herself, but there was nothing left to say. Marcus closed the folder in front of him. No one moved. No one breathed. Asami pushed her chair back, the scrape of wood against the floor, echoing through the boardroom. She walked out without another word, leaving behind the illusion of power she'd clung to. That was the moment she lost everything. Not with shouting or chaos, but with quiet, undeniable truth. And as the door closed behind her, I felt the weight of years of silence shift into something stronger. Triumph. Not loud or boastful, but steady, final, and absolute. Wayne left the house that I had helped him buy and moved into a small apartment across the river. It was modest, a single bedroom with a kitchen barely large enough for Roan's chair, but it was his. He began therapy, something he had once dismissed as unnecessary, and he started spending Saturday mornings at a community garden where neighbors shared stories while pulling weeds from the soil. I heard about it through short messages he sent me, just updates about the work, or the tomatoes they had planted. Nothing more, but each one carried a small sign that he was rebuilding. Back at Maple Street, the silence felt different than before. It was no longer the hollow silence of loss, but something that asked me to reflect. I wondered if I had saved Myson from a life built on deceit, or if I'd simply taken away his right to see the truth on his own. The question stayed with me in the evenings, as I sat in the living room, the light from the lamps spilling across the same wooden floor Kenneth once polished with his hands. One afternoon, Marcus came by with a box of old records and a quiet look on his face. Over coffee, he told me what I had never known about Amy. She'd grown up poor, Her parents gone before she finished middle school, and she had spent years bouncing between relatives who never wanted her. Her ambition, her hunger for more, had not just been greed, but fear of slipping back into that emptiness. I sat with that truth for a long time. It did not excuse her choices, but it softened the edges of my anger. That night I returned to my desk. The warm glow of the lamp made the room feel smaller, gentler. I opened my journal and wrote that family is not about silence or sacrifice. It is about truth, respect, and the courage to set boundaries. I placed an old photo of Kenneth and Wayne on the table, their smiles frozen in a time when love seemed simple, and I lit a small candle beside it. The flame flickered, casting light across their faces, and for the first time in many years, the house on Maple Street felt whole again.